Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Chadwick. I'm our editor for EU Affairs for the My Europe section of our website. So we're just waiting for our speakers to join. We're going to have our speakers join and we're going to get started in a second. Thanks so much for joining us today. Again, hello everybody. My name is Lauren Chadwick. I'm the editor for EU Affairs for the My Europe section of our website. So we're just waiting for our speakers to join, and then we're going to get started. Thank you again for joining us. Okay, so I see that several of our speakers have joined, so we're going to get started. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Today we're going to discuss the European political community, which was an idea proposed by French President Emmanuel Macron on May 9th, also known as Europe Day. He first spoke about this at the end of the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was a series of citizen debates on how to reform the EU. So as part of this announcement, Macron said that the EU cannot be the only way of structuring the European continent, and he referenced French President François Mitterrand's 1989 idea of a European confederation. And Macron said that instead of then, now is the time to organize Europe with a broader scope. So this was endorsed by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who said in Prague in August that what was lacking among European leaders was a regular exchange at the political level, one in which heads of state and government meet once or twice a year to discuss key issues that impact the continent. So today is that inaugural meeting of this new potential European forum. And to discuss what this is and what is likely to be part of the discussions in Prague today, we have three experts who are joining us as part of this Twitter space. And I see they've all joined us, so we're ready to go. Today we have Steven Blockmans, who's Director of Research at the Center for European Policy Studies. We have Ilke Teuger, a Professor of European Geopolitics at the University Carlos III of Madrid, and Richard Whitman, a Professor of Political Science at the University of Kent. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good morning.
So just as a reminder to all of our speakers in the Twitter space that if you could mute yourself until you unmute yourself to talk, that would be the best way to do it. And I'll be asking questions of all of our speakers, and you who are listening, if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to comment on Twitter, and our social media editor, James, will be collecting your questions that we'll ask our speakers as well. So Ilke, I wanted to start with you. This is yet another international forum or organization. We already have the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So break this down for us. Why do leaders want another forum for discussion?
Hello, good morning, Lauren. I think this is a great question and it's already on the minds of many. For me, there are two key reasons to do that. And the first one is that we need a platform to improve the relations between the EU and non-EU countries in a rather more EU-centric way. I will come to that. And secondly, all these institutions that you have mentioned, they were created in the 20th century with the 20th century challenges on minds of the leaders. And when we look at the recent challenges in the continent, I'm not just speaking about the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but everything that we have been going through from the COVID-19 pandemic to all the discussions about irregular migration, securing critical infrastructure in the continent, fighting against climate change. We have a new set of challenges in the continental space. And for me, in addition to this platform to improve relations between the EU and non-EU countries, it is also a part of this rethinking multilateralism in the 21st century exercise. We are trying to create, we still need to see what this is going to be, but we are trying to create a new multilateral, continental rather, platform to discuss and better coordinate the challenges that we face in 21st century.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of really important points about the challenges that have kind of fueled the creation of this political community. Stephen, I want to go to you. Do you think that European leaders are going to be able to agree on joining such a forum? Do they agree that these challenges merit a new international forum for discussion?
Well, obviously, because otherwise they wouldn't have traveled to Prague today. 44 of them deemed it necessary to engage in discussions on the topics that Macron and Michel and the Czech presidency have built for this summit. I think first and foremost, though, it provides a photo opportunity to show Mr. Putin that the rest of Europe is united in keeping a form of multilateralism on the European security order intact. I agree that the organizations that exist, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, they're in a lethargic state. They've been hijacked for years by Russia. And there is a need, clearly, for a new platform. But at the same time, this an afternoon's talk about mega issues such as security and stability in Europe, energy security, economic cooperation, etc., certainly not enough. And the invitation letter already mentioned that there wouldn't be a written communique coming out of this. So the sustainability of this format really depends on whether the leaders see merit to continue it, whether they can agree on a mandate or a set of objectives, tasks, and of such a platform, and whether they're willing to enable that construct with financial and human resources. I don't see it happening that quickly, in fact.
So I definitely want to come back to the how it would function question, because I think that that's some of the main questions that people have been posing are, how would this work? But I want to come back to that. Richard, I want to talk to you, because one of the news lines that has come out of this is that Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a former EU member, as we know, is going to join this meeting in Prague today. What is the UK's interest in joining, and could it ease some of the tensions over Brexit?
Well, thanks very much for setting this up, because I think it's a great topic, and as we've already heard, there are so many issues for us to think about. From the UK's perspective, I think it raises some general issues about what non-EU countries see they might get out of this exercise, and I think they have quite different and quite disparate views. But for the UK in particular, I think it's just a bit of curiosity. There isn't too much cost involved for Liz Truss to go. It allows for a soft signal that the UK is interested in something which is a pan-European initiative, but there are also some concerns that the UK already has. It's expressed a view that it doesn't really like the label that's attached to European political community. It's suggested that European Political Forum might be a better way to label it, because the real domestic political concern, but I think also a concern that we shared by some other countries, not least Turkey, is that this shouldn't be a forum where the EU is able to exercise some sort of hegemonic power or control, because a third of the participants are not EU members. Of course, within that, it's a disparate group. Some want to be members of the EU, and some, like the UK, Norway, and Switzerland, clearly don't at this time. So I think it really is a kind of watch and see. For me, I mean, the characteristic is really some sort of large speed dating exercise. That it's difficult to see how you get something substantive easily, but it has a use in terms of allowing all of these leaders to get together in a way that's not available in another format like this.
What an interesting metaphor for speed dating. I wonder if off of that, Ilke, I know you wanted to talk about this. Could you go through the expectations for EU countries versus non-EU countries who are joining the meeting in Prague today?
Actually, very happy to, and I also loved Richard's speed date metaphor here. But just looking from an EU perspective and a non-EU perspective, I think for the EU member states, the expectation is clear. Now, to organize the continent in a more EU-centric way, and if possible, create some kind of coordination and even alignment in the future with the EU, because we know that candidate countries and maybe even some potential candidates countries have the will to align with the EU, but for the rest there is no need for alignment. So this expectation of alignment is a very big point of contestation. The EU may hope for that, but we will see if this a platform like this can serve to that. But from a non-EU point of view, I think for them this should create a rather geopolitical platform which is designed on equal footing. Because I think they agree that there's a need for cooperation in the continent when it comes to a broader definition of security, energy, migration, but they would not like to become policy takers from the EU. So they ask for a less asymmetric decision making, and maybe even an acknowledgement from the EU. I don't know if it will come, that the EU needs third countries in the region to deal with overarching challenges like fight against climate change or securing even its own supply chains. So for me, the key word here is equal footing. And if the other non-EU countries are expected to become policy takers or not. Because if it is on equal footing, I think it has the potential to serve better coordination right now, exchanging notes between the leaders, the speed date set up for today. And in the future, maybe even more coherence in policy making, but not necessarily as alignment to the EU, as I have said in the beginning, but rather a space for co-creating policies in the continent.
So off of this idea of equal footing, Stephen, I wonder if you could comment on that. Is that realistic? Because obviously the invitation letter is sent by the European Council. This is an idea that was announced at the Conference on the Future of Europe. Is it possible to have equal footing, do you think, in this context? How would it have to be designed for that?
Well, there are 27 of the 44 leaders that are, of course, leading EU member states. So, in numbers, the EU is well represented, so to speak, and will have an interest in keeping the non-EU members to the commitments that have been made in bilateral or other unilateral formats. What I think hasn't been stressed yet enough, I mean, I've suggested ways, if there's to be a form of sustainability to this construct, I've suggested ways of doing that, and Ilke added to that. What we haven't discussed yet is the discontent of a couple of, or the reluctance of a couple of non-members to join this idea, simply because of the worry they have that they might be parked, in a new format which detracts from their ambitions to get closer to the European Union. And Ukraine is, of course, the most vulnerable, but also the greatest demandeur in that respect, to keep the enlargement track intact. And the leaders of these countries will worry, of course, that Macron, the initiator of this European political community idea, in the beginning of September, in front of his own assembled ambassadors in Paris, suggested that the EPC might be, a helpful way to stop. Il faut stopper. Nice linguistic invention that he added there. La logique de l'élargissement infini de l'Union européenne. This, the endless enlargement of the European Union. So that worry of Ukraine, Western Balkan states, Moldovan leader is warranted in that respect. It's the EU with its member states will have to really show that they're serious also on the EU enlargement track to keep those non-EU countries that want to join the EU from moving forward.
I definitely want to talk about this this kind of criticism that there's been of the European political community. We obviously they haven't met yet, so some of what we're talking about today is kind of looking ahead at what it could become. But some of the early criticism when it was first mentioned, which continues, is a lot of the countries attending in Prague today have already applied to join the EU, and we know that it has been a long process. Only just recently have Albania and North Macedonia, Albania particularly, been able to begin accession talks. So could this be a way of putting off accession talks? Ilke, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think Stephen already underlined the key point here that the creator of this idea, or the first defender of this idea, is Emmanuel Macron, and we know that he has been a long-standing skeptical of EU enlargement. So this is not a good combination for the candidate countries and potential candidate countries that are really willing to join the EU. So I totally agree. So if we want the European political community to move forward, at the same time we need to witness certain developments when it comes to both like advancing in enlargement process and also in the internal reform process that the EU has to go through before being able to enlarge and include further countries. But for me, I think I want to add one more point when it comes to this. What would the candidates expect? What would the EFTA countries may expect? And the UK, of course. I participated in a workshop in Istanbul about this and what could and should the European political community become. And one of the things that really struck my attention was the participants were underlining and over again the need for creation of a Europe that more people than EU citizens can feel the feeling of belonging to. So they really wanted to create an organization that they can feel that they can belong to, and there can be some kind of grassroots membership and ownership there on the citizens level. And it was quite interesting for me. So in this sense, European political community could serve to non-EU member states also, like, to be a little more patient for a new enlargement, if this feeling of belonging to goes hand in hand with transitional integration, certain benefits for the members, and a platform for real dialogue and policy making. Clearly, all these are rainbows and butterflies if there is no institutional setup to back that. So I think we're just like circling around ideas and maybe being a bit dreamy about all this. And unless we see a strong institutional setup that can create these dynamics, we should still hold our breath a bit.
Richard, I'd like to go to you on the kind of basis for this new international community. And for those listeners who are just joining us, we're discussing the European political community and kind of what the expectations are for EU countries and non-EU countries. And Richard, what we see is that the crises from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine and now the energy crisis, which of course is related, have seen foreign policy, particularly for the EU and the UK, perhaps become more aligned. Do you think that this European political community could counterbalance Russia? Is that something that we've talked about it being kind of a photo opportunity to show Putin, but could it act as a counterbalance to Russia?
Well, clearly, the fact that Russia and Belarus aren't invited means that the gathering already has a particular flavour, and most of the issues that are going to be discussed by the leaders have either been created by or exacerbated by Russia's war on Ukraine. So, but it's not really a sort of gathering of a coalition. I guess for me, the question is if it is some sort of security forum, or some sort of forum in which you work through some of the geopolitical and the geoeconomic issues that exist for Europeans. What added value does this organization have? We have clearly some organizations in Europe which are all embracing, and we've already heard the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and as Stephen said earlier, I mean, it's essentially moribund because of Russia's activity there. But we have other organizations that set very high thresholds to entry, like NATO and the EU, which means all of the participants who are not members of those organizations for different reasons we're not going to have them aligned. So, what place might it occupy in Europe's international relations? And for what purpose? And then to what degree do you need an infrastructure to make it a viable and successful organization? I think some parallels have been drawn with the G7 or the G20 as having that kind of format. But one of the things that makes the G7 effective, for example, is its selectivity in terms of membership. But also there's a very strong impetus that comes from countries holding the presidency. And I think absolutely crucially, that not only does it tackle the big issues, but it also sets as a way that you can combine implementation on big and difficult issues. And I guess, if you have aspirations to turn this organization into something like that, then it's going to be a very, very long haul. But it would arguably do something distinctive, I think. But I'm not yet convinced that it has, or we've seen anything that sort of convinces me that the problem that's there to solve is clearly defined, and this setup is the best way to solve that problem.
So we have a comment from one of our listeners that it might just be too early to discuss and to wait for the result of the meeting today. And it's a good segue into what I also would like to talk about, which is they've said that there won't be a formal written agreement outcome from today's meeting. Is that a surprise? And what are you expecting from the discussion in Prague? So let me start with Stephen on that question.
Is it a surprise? Well, there are so many different perspectives that are being brought around the table that it indeed would have been an extremely difficult exercise to rally everyone behind a common text. I mean, there are certain leaders who won't see eye to eye with one another. Leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan. President Erdogan might have difficulties looking into the eyes of his Greek and Cypriot counterparts, etc. Plus, I think a written outcome would have probably defeated the entire purpose of the speed dating element that Richard referred to. I mean, this is for many an opportunity. If you think about from a Norwegian or an Icelandic perspective, for example, whose relations are heavily constrained by the European Economic Area to which they belong with the European Union. And when leaders meet, they essentially have to follow heavily scripted documents prepared by their administrations. This is really an opportunity to talk shop, to have these more free-flowing conversations at leader level only. I mean, the plenum is, I believe, just the leaders, and then the breakout sessions may be, at least has been whispered, a +1 arrangement. But these are fairly light organizational items. So I would have not expected, indeed, a strong final communique to have been produced. But at the same time, that endangers, of course, the entire effort. I mean, it might very well prove to be an ephemeral exercise in the end, just like we've had in the past. Remember that Macron's predecessor, François Mitterrand, played with the idea of a European confederation, and that the European Council itself, at the end of December 1997 in Luxembourg, decided to create a European conference, which was organized with the Balkan states. I mean, this was after the violent implosion of Yugoslavia, and later added countries like Ukraine. But this initiative died a silent death in 2001. And who's to say that the same might not happen to this European political community if indeed it is not properly structured, if leaders do not agree to the type of mission for this European political community, if that is the name that will be kept, which is up for discussion. And if they don't equip the organizations as to try and fulfill the objectives that they want to rally behind.
Richard, do you want to? I know you have to leave us earlier, so do you want to jump in on that and react to what Stephen just said?
Well, I think the Stephen's point is well made, that it's difficult to see, and indeed it would have been an obstacle if you were trying to get some form of text agreed on the part of these states in the run up to the meeting, and that's where the existing structures already have a process attached to them, and also a sort of tempo to their work. Again, if the EU is a particularly extreme version of this, but the G7 is exactly the same. Almost any successful regional or international organization has a combination of some kind of secretariat, some kind of driving political arrangement, which might be a presidency or a secretary general, has a bit of money, but absolutely crucially has a purpose that the member states see is one that they want to be associated with, or brings them some benefit that they don't get elsewhere. If I was going to sort of seek out a comparator organization to this, and where we might actually end up, is probably the Union for the Mediterranean, which was again a sort of French diplomatic initiative, and brings together the EU member states with states around the Mediterranean basin. I think just about 25 years old now, well known by specialists working in this area, but it hasn't really done anything that I think would make people sit up and pay attention in terms of an impact on the sort of management of that region. So it's possible that we might see an enthusiasm for much more by way of process, but I think a measure of success will be just being able to have a second meeting, just seeing the participants agree that there was value in coming, making the space in their diaries, appearing at that sort of head of state, head of government level, because that is a big success, having people at that level attending this meeting, and let's set the bar a little bit low in terms of being realistic about what it might achieve.
Let's set the bar low. Ilke, do you want to come in on that and tell us what do you think will come from the discussion in Prague today? And off of what Richard said, is this already a success for Macron getting all of these, 40 countries to the table today?
'Cause, I think for me, this is a great first and a success for everyone. Because for the EU, for example, after years of stalled accession negotiations with many in the neighborhood and making them very, very sad and angry at the EU, this is a success. After all the failures we had in the neighborhood policy that also undermined the EU's values and its sphere of influences in the neighborhood, this is a success. And for the non-EU countries, they had, as Stephen said, no, they all had their own formats to relate with the EU, European Economic Area, all these accession negotiations. Clearly, Brexit negotiations. So the UK and the EU can organize a relationship. They didn't have a leadership level format to discuss all these at a continental level. So for me, bringing all these leaders to Prague today and making them just talk, exchange notes, and organize all these bilateral and unilateral and multilateral meetings is a success. So this is the starting point for me. Then clearly for me to become something at a little longer term than it already is will be decided if they can define the roadmap for the future. And the second, and organizing the second meeting and putting a date on it, and the country, if as whispered it's going to be Moldova or not, is going to be the second step. But then, from clearly the institutional setup should be the third step, but that requires further discussion. So I'm not so sure if they are going to dive into that at the leadership level now, or rather leave it to preparations between Sherpas and delegations for the meetings to come. And then the fourth step would be rather discussing what is going to be in and what is going to be out, with what resources, money and human resources, secretariat, etc., etc. So these are all steps to be taken. But for Prague itself, we got the 44 continental leaders in one place, even if some of them cannot stand to look at each other. I think this deserves a glass of champagne. Yes.
So a glass of champagne for the leaders for showing up to work in Prague today. So Stephen, do you have any last thoughts? What are the outstanding questions for you on this political community, and how can the leaders prove that this is worth it, as we can say, and not going to, as you say in the beginning, become just another forum that's kind of lethargic, as you said?
Well, we'll be looking out for all the press statements that leaders will make, of course, after this gathering, presumably to their domestic media, and then try and triangulate whether there is indeed, a common space, common land that could be tilled, so to speak. I imagine that there will be a lot of some just thumping as far as the EU member states is concerned, in terms of corralling the rest of Europe around the idea that multilateralism is still alive, that the European security order needs to be saved from the attack launched by Mr. Putin and his vassal in Minsk. But I don't expect much more from that. And I agree with Ilke that for any future step on the way, it will require a more concentrated effort and perhaps a better prepared effort at organizing the next meeting in Moldova.
Richard, do you have any final thoughts on what you're expecting from today?
Well, I think the key for all of these initiatives is whether they add value. And Europe is a really crowded space in terms of regional and sub-regional organizations which are successful to varying degrees. And ultimately, the leaders and the attendees are only going to get back something if they're willing to put something in. But to put something in, they've also got to understand what the value would be of the return. But I think, you know, what's interesting is that you have had all of these leaders come together to have this opportunity to brainstorm, because it is a fairly flimsy agenda. So in and of itself, I think perhaps it says something about the sort of existing geopolitical, geoeconomic mindset of Europe's leaders, which may be a positive. You know, they want to talk, even if they don't quite know exactly what conclusion they want to reach.
Elke, do you want to react to what Richard just said?
Actually, I just want to pick one word, and it was geoeconomics, because when we think about security and defense, this may sound rather well organized. We have the NATO and everything, but when I think about what could be the added value of such a European political community, is that I'm rather thinking about energy, economy, all the discussions around the security of supply chains and access to raw materials, climate change, and all these areas are areas where the EU has competences. So if we could find the good setup for such a platform that gives both the room for an EU-centric approach to these geoeconomic challenges and kind of create a common area for policy alignment and equal footing, which is kind of a mission impossible, by the way. This is why we need to discuss the institutional setup very carefully there. There is room for an organization that can add value to continental cooperation. So the definition of institutional setup and the definition of what kind of areas will be treated in this platform are crucial for knowing if this organizational platform can bring some kind of an added value in the future. And I think, two additional final remarks thinking about the initiative. For me, it should not undermine the EU and its values and its policies and programs in the region. For me, starting with enlargement, clearly, but everything else that we have at hand. And secondly, when we think about 44, this is a super big number, right? And all these countries, they don't necessarily see eye to eye in many things. But if we could set up a basic minimum for democratic principles, which could be like Charter of Fundamental Rights, etc., different than EU conditionality in general, we could create a platform for collaborations in different areas with the coalition of the willing. We don't need to 44 on board in everything. There could be smaller subgroups that could serve for better coordination and cooperation in the continent. This is not necessarily for discussion for today. This is more for the future and very much depends on the institutional setup. But I think we should rather keep the canvas broad and as wide as possible, so then innovative ideas could be painted on it.
A lot of good metaphors came out of this Twitter space. I'm so happy. So we have a new, fresh canvas for the European political community that has its inaugural meeting today in Prague. You can follow our live coverage on the European political community today on euronews.com. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to our three speakers. Stephen Blockmans, Richard Whitman, and Ilke Teuger. And thanks to all of you for joining us today to listen. I think that what we've learned is this could have an added value, but there are a lot of questions down the line. So we'll be in touch with our speakers to learn their thoughts after the meeting as well. So again, follow our coverage on euronews.com, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.